And sometimes it just takes asking those audiences what's most useful for them and not making assumptions. So you might be able to just kind of ask, like, I have these results. How would you want it presented? How can we share conversations about this? What is the best format for you? And I've always found that kind of works the best.
Greetings, fellow explorers, and welcome to the 24th episode of Geekoscopy 101, the podcast that explores the intersection between science, story, and play, with me, your host, Dr. Yanis Kistin, and today we're exploring the wonders of wildlife conservation, research, and technology with Gabi Fleury. All right, welcome to the show, Gabi. How are you doing?
Doing well. Great to be here.
It's really exciting to have you on. We had a lot of scheduling conflicts here, being halfway across the world from each other. But you did live in South Africa at one point, and I suppose we'll get into that. But before we do, tell us a bit about yourself, who you are in this moment, and what you do.
I'm a conservation biologist. I term myself kind of a conservation biologist / technologist. Most of my work has to do with human-wildlife conflict mitigation, particularly predator and livestock conflict mitigation. So working with farmers to try to reduce livestock losses to carnivores using different non-lethal deterrents, as well as trying to understand some of the underlying reasoning behind some of that conflict. So not just on the behavioral side of wildlife, but also, working with communities to try to understand some of the socio-political or cultural context behind that conflict as well. I currently work for an organization called Rainforest Trust, where I manage some of our Africa projects. So I'm also involved a little bit in protected area management.
That's on your research side, but you do some science communication work, conservation type of outreach as well. So tell us a bit about that journey as well.
I'm really, really interested in science communication in terms of, I think it's a great way to get people interested in science and kind of share that with all different kinds of audiences. So I started a YouTube channel called Breaking Bio, which interviews diverse practitioners in STEM, not just conservation. So that went on a bit of hiatus just because I got waylaid by papers and applying to grad school and all these different things. But I'm going to be starting that up in the next couple of months. And I've also been involved in Black Mammalogists Week, which is an awareness campaign to look at the contributions of Black mammalogists, both historically and currently. So I've been involved in that group as well as publicizing the BIPOC scholarship that we're working on collaborating with the American Society of Mammalogists to instate, which just got passed. So it's actually going to happen, which is really exciting. And and I was lucky enough to be featured in Forbes magazine for the 30 Under 30 2021, which is really exciting because they
cool.
never, it was cool. I didn't expect that to happen at all. It was very much a surprise. But it was cool because usually, people who are featured are engineers or they're physicists. And this is the first year that we actually had conservationists on there, and it was 3 conservationists of color, which is really exciting. And also as a non-binary scientist, it was really exciting to kind of be there. When they had a little gender breakdown, it was like male, female, and like a tiny little line, and that was me. So, it was kind of cool to be able to bring some of that representation.
Diversification. Yeah, It's always interesting. I think, I don't know whether it's on the part of not being, I suppose, not that great at marketing when it comes to the life sciences, especially like conservation, or I think larger animal science. I think the DNA and the immunology and those type of sides do get a lot of exposure on mainstream media. So I think it's really cool that you got in being a conservationist, because it's really tough, I think, in our sort of fields to get the word out there and to get on big platforms. So congrats, that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
So how did getting to wildlife science and conservation start? Where was that spark during your years that decided to get you down this field of study?
It's always a really hard question for me to answer because I've wanted to do this since before I can kind of consciously remember it. I always joke that maybe I saw too many cartoons, that I was really into Captain Planet. But my dad is Brazilian, but he's of Angolan descent. So I've always felt really tied into the SADC region. So I grew up hearing, mythology stories and things from him, and he's very tied into that part of his culture. So that's probably where some of the interest in Southern Africa specifically came from that side. But I remember just being very distressed at a very young age about kind of the state of the world and, wildlife, and being concerned about that. And that's actually where I started getting interested in human wildlife conflict very young, because I read, as a kid, that after, like habitat loss is the biggest impact on large predators and how important large predators are to ecosystems. So yeah, it's always just been something I've been really passionate about doing. I don't remember this, but I had a little tin that said "Gabi Goes to Angola Fund" when I was like 3 years old.
Really?
I used to put
Cool.
little like nickels and things in there.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I've never been to Angola. I just saw it across the river when I was working in Namibia. But I got to pay for some of my Kruger trip using some of the savings from my little fund, which is kind of cool. So it's always been something that I've wanted to do. I've been a lifer, so.
Yeah. Since immemorial, basically, since the start. Yeah, I mean,
basically, yeah.
I mean, like my story is like 8, so like that's like 5 years earlier than that, so that's hectic. And I don't know how does a 3-year-old conceptualize these type of things, to even understand. So that's really cool. Yeah. And when it comes to, disseminating, the information that you create in your research, when did that kind of start? Was there any point where you realized it's important to start talking about this out of an academic context, and where was that?
So that's a really good question. I think that came, when I was a little bit more experienced. I did my undergraduate thesis on lion and livestock conflict in Amboseli, Kenya. So I was working with mostly Maasai herders. It was really interesting speaking to those individuals, because I realized, a lot of the places where research outcomes are going into, such as, peer-reviewed journals and things, those are important, but they're not really getting to the people who need it to be able to actually mitigate that conflict. So to governmental people and people on the ground, as well as communities themselves, in a way that people can actually use. And a lot of the time, the best way to be able to share that information was just speaking with communities in kind of an informal setting and being able to share kind of like what I've seen and how that relates to their lives and whether or not that's useful, and being able to kind of tailor what I'm doing to also what's most useful for the community. So rather than for me approaching kind of a project by saying, okay, I want to answer this question, I would come in saying, okay, I want to answer this question, but what else do you need from somebody in this context? And how can my research also help fill the need that the community has in terms of what information they need to be able to make things safer? And that might be something spatial, like they want to get a sense of how predators are moving so they can adjust their own, how they herd their animals. Or they want to get a sense of, different aspects of non-lethal deterrence that you can use to try to prevent predators from eating their livestock. But, we come in with all these ideas of how systems work. And I remember thinking, livestock enclosures, if we can figure out how to put things around livestock enclosures, we're going to really help mitigate this problem. And then when I actually sat down and spoke to these individuals, they're just like, we lose maybe a couple from a livestock enclosure, but it's mostly out in the field where that's the problem. And that's a much more complicated question to answer. So that's kind of where I first started being interested in kind of science communication outside of academia, because it's great to be able to communicate with other scientists, but in terms of real world impacts, it's really important to be able to adjust for different audiences. And sometimes it just takes asking those audiences what's most useful for them and not making assumptions. So you might be able to just kind of ask, I have these results. How would you want it presented? How can we share conversations about this? What is the best format for you? And I've always found that kind of works the best.
Yeah, I suppose, it's targeting audiences are always difficult, but if you don't even know what your audience wants, I suppose you're just speaking or screaming into the void, essentially.
Yeah.
What were some of the most either exciting or kind of surprising things that you discovered during your time looking at these conflicts between wildlife and people?
I thought that these problems, coming into it when I was 20 years old, I think, coming into this and, kind of going off just what I've learned from books and what I've learned from papers into an actual real world system. I I underestimated how important perception of conflict was. So I kind of started thinking in terms of like, okay, there's very clear variables, right? There's the actual number of conflict that's happening, and there's the different things that are driving it, which could be, human caused, or it could just be, environmental causes. But I didn't realize how much it's important in terms of like how people perceive perception. Because even though, for example, when I was working in Namibia, so they really don't like African wild dogs, really don't like them. But jackals were a bigger problem. Like, they didn't like jackals either, but they didn't have that same immediate gut reaction of hating jackals, even though jackals were taking more of their livestock. And it was because, they might lose like a sheep here or a sheep there. And over time, they lose more to jackals. But because of the way the African wild dogs hunt, where it's kind of, they come in and they take out a bunch of animals at once, it's more memorable. So they have a stronger like reaction to African wild dogs, even though they're less of a problem. So I think like some of those aspects as well, in terms of just kind of like how people perceive different predators, and how even, within that changes over time. So someone might think something about predators in one instance, and then over time that could change, or it's, different depending on what predators, or depending on the person, so like not looking at groups as kind of homogenous, and looking, like there might be different factors that might make people more tolerant or less tolerant. So just kind of the incredible complexity around these issues, which is why we haven't, actually, we've mitigated, but we haven't solved human-wildlife conflict. And I honestly doubt we ever will completely solve human-wildlife conflict. But I think that's what makes it such an interesting kind of puzzle, because you're having to be kind of like a behavioral, ecologist, but you're also having to be a bit of an anthropologist to be able to, understand kind of the human aspect of what people are perceiving and what's on their side that might be, either mitigating, potentially driving, or shifting the conflict in some cases, which is really fascinating.
For sure.
Yeah.
And these things are changing all the time as well. I mean, human beings are changing all the time, culture is shifting all the time, the environment is shifting all the time. So I suppose we have to have a constant lookout onto how things are changing, and how, we can change to help. But I suppose it's always up to management and policy, and how quickly they can change to catch up. That's always, I think, the issue that we have, or at least I've seen. So you're from the States, right? North America.
Yeah, I'm Brazilian American, so I have a dual citizenship of Brazil and the States.
Okay, so do you spend a lot of time in South America?
Pre-COVID, I used to go every couple of years. And then since COVID, I haven't been back since that hit. But yeah, my dad and my whole family on that side is in Brazil. So I try to visit as much as I can.
Okay, so you probably have a good idea of what different wildlife is like on three big continents. What are some of your highlights as to the differences in the ecology?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I think what's really interesting with North America is that, we have a tendency, and I won't include myself as North Americans because I consider myself part of the, global North and global South. But North Americans, we tend to go about and tell the global South how to manage their wildlife, but we have very little wildlife, which I always think is really interesting. Again, 20 years old, my first time in Africa, this Kenyan conservationist totally took me to school because he was like, yeah, you Americans, you're always telling us how to conserve, your megafauna. Where's your megafauna? And I was like, that's a very decent point. And it's the same thing in South America as well. Like, we don't really have the same amount of megafauna as, Africa or Asia does. So that's really interesting. But the cool thing about HWC is that even though it varies depending on, what communities you're working in, like what part of the world you're in, there's often a lot of overlap as well in terms of like some of these issues are very similar all over the world. So it's really interesting kind of seeing both the similarities and those differences in terms of, how to manage some of those conflicts, which is cool. Yeah.
What's your, I don't know whether you've thought about this, but what's your idea on what happened to America's big megafauna? I think there's two big theories, right? It's either that humans wiped them out, or there's some kind of natural disaster that got rid of them.
I think it was both. But I also think combination of factors.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing with like in the States especially is that because of the high amount of development, it's really difficult for there to be enough space, especially for like wide-ranging species. So I lived in Alaska as a kid for a couple of years, and that was really cool because you still can see things like wolves and bear and things like that need that space. But in terms of like the lower 48, they're just, I mean, you can have protected areas and set places aside for them, but it's just constant encroachment of development, which is kind of what's happening all over the world. And wildlife is getting more and more squeezed in terms of where they can travel. So it takes a lot of really intensive management and forethought, which doesn't always happen in terms of thinking about, how can we help these animals be able to move through highly developed landscapes.
So as you know, that's happening, human population's increasing over time, people are changing, culture is shifting, modernization is happening sometimes on a rapid scale in some parts. How do you as a conservationist plan to keep up with the changes in culture, and how do you think others should also try to modernize how they tackle the type of issues that you want to tackle?
Yeah, I think a major way to try to modernize it is that, fortress conservation is not something that's acceptable anymore. We can't just draw a big fence around something and be like, everybody keep out. It just doesn't work. It's not effective. I think that's kind of like, in the old days, maybe when there were less people and we didn't really understand the ethical implications of what we were doing as much, maybe things were different. But I think, now I think there's just needs to be a lot more engagement in terms of the communities that actually live in those areas and understanding what their priorities and their needs are and trying to, compromise and find ways to allow conservation to help benefit those communities, which is tricky because, ecotourism is not a panacea. We can't just kind of make everything into a tourist hotspot. But I do think it's really important, modernizing to think critically about the fact that people are tied to the landscape and trying to reduce things like helicopter conservation. One of the reasons why I really enjoy working for the organization I work for now, Rainforest Trust, is that we actually don't have conservationists that are full-time based on the ground. We work with local conservationists and kind of serve as, assistants in terms of kind of like some of the science and things like that. But with people, on the ground, they're the ones who are the experts and they're the ones who really understand their systems. And that's something that really struck me is that, I wanted to do this my whole life, but I'm still never going to understand a particular system as much as somebody who's been there their whole life. So I think it's also some of the modernization is kind of learning humility as scientists and learning that, we're specialists, we're good at something in particular, but we don't know everything. And we need to have all these other people who are the real experts in terms of how a system works to be able to make conservation sustainable. And the fact that, let's be real, like as international researchers, we're going to pack up and we're going to leave. We can try to make it as sustainable as possible, but that's going to happen. So I think building capacity of the people who are located there or leveraging the capacity they already have, because some of them may be very high, capacity already, is crucial because they're the ones who are going to kind of carry on the conservation work after, we peace out. So I think that's really important. And I do think that conservation is moving away from this kind of like neo-colonial mindset, but I think it is going to take a lot more time for that to kind of come to fruition.
It's interesting. Yeah. I haven't heard the term helicopter conservationists before. That's new for me. I know the idea, and the science side of it is like parachute science. So it's an interesting new term. Parachuting science has come up on this podcast a few times, and it's always a thing where it just makes so much sense not to do, but people do it anyway. But I think it's also probably improving now as the world gets more open and people become more aware that you can't just go and invade places and do whatever you want, even if it is in the name of science and conservation. You have to speak and collaborate with the locals. It's just a good idea for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. It's also, even just from a sense of science, like you can't do good science if you're not collaborating with the locals, because the second you leave, like everything's just going to fall apart. So, yeah. I mean, from every perspective in terms of scientific, ethical, and just, in general, just good practices. It just makes the most sense. And I think people are starting to understand that.
For sure. There's hope. Yeah. Or let's hope at least. So speaking about modernization and stuff, you've also delved into a lot of, you've delved into technological platforms like video games. So you started working on a video game that does include wildlife conservation. So what is this game about, and why did you choose a video game as a platform for it?
Yeah, so the video game came about. So one of my really good friends is a software engineer. And I had realized, through some of my work abroad, that interactive play was a really great way to kind of teach, and that people were actually able to, understand different concepts a lot faster and remember it and be able to extrapolate from that rather than just kind of, traditional oral, just like rote repetition information sharing. So kind of just going off this idea of, interactivity as being such a huge benefit. Video game was kind of a really cool kind of like novel idea I had and I think it shouldn't just be used kind of on its own. I think skits are really great for like remote places. You could even do board games and things like that. But I wanted to kind of see how a video game would work. And it was a huge challenge because it has 3 mini games. There's one about the building of a livestock enclosure. So basically you see a livestock enclosure, there's something wrong with it that could cause a predator to like sneak into the livestock enclosure. And you have to figure out what that is and fix it. And if you don't fix it, then there's like a consequence to that. And then there's also a game about predator identification. So it's track, scat, and the kill style of the predator on like a goat or a sheep. And that's to help people try to be able to identify which predator may be the issue, because you kind of can adapt your mitigation efforts depending on what your predators that you have in the area and what you're dealing with. And the third one is a game, was basically a video about the impact of poisoning livestock carcasses, because a lot of the time people will actually put poison on livestock carcasses, like just leave them out to try to kill predators. This kind of shows why it's such a huge issue, right? Not just for the ecosystem effects in terms of vultures and anything that basically eats that, but also for the human health effects and the environmental effects as well. So what we did is that, we created this working with an organization called Nyasa Carnivore Project in Mozambique, and they kind of helped us refine it and beta test it. And the hard thing about this, and the reason why it took us a year of development, was because we really had to have it without text. It had to be picture only because of just the practicalities of using it in the field. It's like, like you walk down the street, there's like 17,000 different languages. So it wasn't really feasible for us to translate it into all those different languages. So by having it picture only, it not only removed that accessibility issue, it just kind of made it just easier to use. So that's what we did. It's picture only. It's called Operation Ferdinand, and it's free to use. And what I'm keen to in the future, and I haven't had time to do this yet, but I'd like to be able to do kind of a more comprehensive study than just our beta test and see how it compares against different aspects of environmental education in terms of disseminating information, but also changing behavior over a long-term time span. So, yeah.
Cool. That'll be really interesting research. If I can help, I would try.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Do you play video games, or are you inspired in some way? If so, what games do you play?
I'm a big gamer. I really like all kinds of games. I think I was really inspired by just kind of the educational computer games I grew up with. There's a lot of really great ones. I'm trying to remember, I don't know if you ever played Math Blasters.
No,
it might be like from the States, but it's like little games that kind of just teach you different concepts and just feeling so engaged and wanting to beat the level so much that I didn't actually remember that I was learning. So that's kind of where that idea came from. But in terms of video games, I really like large scale, open RPGs. I've been playing The Witcher 3 this entire quarantine period because it's just been so much fun. But yeah, so I think games are they're not only, great pieces of art, but I think they can be great ways to kind of, tell stories and teach and learn and collaborate with other people as well. Especially when you're not able to interact with people face to face, it's a really great way to be able to have that kind of, social interaction with different individuals across the world as well. So.
For sure. Super agree. I love The Witcher 3. It's one of my favorite games. I think I've played it twice.
Yeah, you can probably see I actually have Geralt's sword behind me right there.
Oh, I did not notice it when you pointed it out. Jeez, I didn't look in that corner, but yeah, that is Geralt's sword.
Yeah,
that's cool.
I do.
That's cool. Did you enjoy the Netflix series? Did you watch it?
Yeah, I love the books, and the Netflix series kind of crammed a bunch of things in a very short time period. But I think it was good for what it was. For me, I actually think the best storytelling in the entire Witches series has to be the games. So.
Yeah. I played 2 Assassins of Kings on PC.
Oh, that's good.
And it was really good. The first one I couldn't manage to get past an hour. I think it was too old. At that point, it's like old game is old. My PC didn't want to run it that well as well. But I suppose the series covers that part, I think. Maybe.
It does, yeah.
But sure, overall, great series. Love it. I'm a super big fanboy of The Witcher.
My other career is I write fantasy books, so I'm actually on submission to editors right now for one of my books, and so it's just
how did I not discover this on my research? Wow.
Yeah.
Are you under a pen name?
I'm under a pen name. But yeah, and that's mostly because I also publish academic papers, so I didn't want that confused. But yeah, so I'm just kind of very into all things fantasy, basically.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I get my fantasy creation off by dungeon mastering, playing D&D. I run a lot of D&D games. Yeah. So discussing all of the plethora of things you have now done across your life, what are some of the major challenges that you've experienced, doing research, disseminating research, just getting to this point?
A little bit about how difficult it is to break into conservation, because I think that's kind of an important thing to talk about. So I grew up relatively low income. So the whole idea of being able to just pay to do research or to be able to get experience was never anything that I could do. So yeah, I've had to hustle really hard. It was really difficult. So what I would do is I had no money, right? So I taught myself GIS off QGIS, just downloaded it for free and then taught myself off YouTube and off different, messaging boards, and got good enough at it that I was able to kind of use that skill set to barter for my first internship, where I literally was just kind of like, look, if I can fly myself down there, will you cover my living expenses, and I'll teach your team how to get better at different spatial science, and you can teach me field skills. So I did a lot of that kind of when I was first starting out. So I would literally kind of do whatever jobs I could find, just to be able to save up for my next plane ticket, and lived really simply, and then traded whatever abilities I was able to come up with. I taught myself grant writing. I taught myself R. I taught myself all kinds of, and I also, coding, so Python and things like that. So I tried to create kind of these analytical skill sets. I was able to kind of match up with organizations that were really great in the field, but maybe needed a little help on the analytical side, and kind of being able to trade that. So I wasn't just kind of another young person saying please give me experience. I wanted to be able to come to them with something that could also benefit them. So that was definitely one of those things. And the same thing with Operation Ferdinand. So I've always been really into the whole idea of, don't wait around on job boards and just apply to what you see, because they're really competitive, especially when you're first starting out, because everyone else can see them too. If you can find them, other people can find them. So a lot of it, was just kind of networking and, getting, to talk to people who I admired. A lot of that was literally when I was first starting out, I'd look up the papers on, subjects I was really interested in. So carnivore conservation or, human wildlife conflict mitigation. And I would start seeing the same names coming up, every single time. And then I would try to, cultivate relationships. And sometimes that was, and it was a little scary, but just try emailing someone and saying hey, I love your paper and I have an additional question about this paper. Can you answer it? And some people were really cool about replying, or it might be connecting to them on Twitter. And the conservation field is so small. The good thing is that once you kind of break in, you can meet everyone very quickly because it's such a small circle. But especially because I work with very charismatic species, it was definitely a challenge. So I always like kind of being open about that, especially to people who are interested in being in conservation. It's absolutely worth it. I wouldn't want to dissuade anyone from doing it. But you really have to be a self-starter and almost entrepreneurial when you're starting out because of the amount of competition and the limited amount of opportunities. So sometimes that's creating a YouTube channel or creating like own opportunities, like somebody who's really good at something and you're really good at something, and you create a project and then use that to be able to leverage further opportunities. So it's definitely one of those big challenges in terms of just like finding your footing. And then now I'm here, they can't get rid of me now. But yeah, so I try to do as much mentoring as I can, working with people, especially from underrepresented groups in conservation, to try to, give as much advice as I have, or, be able to help them out as much as I can.
Cool. You managed to answer multiple questions with one question. You're both giving a challenge and some advice for future people who want to do the type of stuff you want to do. That's efficiency right there.
Great.
So what are you looking forward to for the second half of 2021? We've all managed to survive 2020 and things are slowly starting to get normal. What are you looking forward to?
Put on hold because of gestures at World, which I mean is completely understandable. And I also kind of feel sad but relieved because at the same time I don't feel really comfortable with any research that would make anyone gather during this particular period in time. So having more space for that is great. So what I'm working on right now is essentially just, now that I'm working at my job for another year before I start my PhD, I am going to be, trying to get all of the old data that I have sitting on my hard drive that I kept going like, oh, I'm going to write a paper about that someday. Like someday is here. I want to actually, be able to, finish some of those up. So I just had a paper published last year, which was my first author publication. I just had another one published a couple days ago. And then I have another one in the work, which is a collaborative paper. So I really want to use this year to help build more relationships and get on more publications with people and work with more people, especially in areas that I'm less familiar with. So kind of building in these larger interdisciplinary papers where I can start meeting some people from other fields, and continuing to do that. And also, kind of connecting back in with my SciComm work now that I'm going to have a little bit more time to focus on that as well, which I'm really excited about because I wanted to do it, but just so much going on. So I'm really looking forward to kind of connecting back into that. And Twitter's been great. I mean, I've just started to be really active on there. And in that time, I've met people that I would never have met. So it's been a really great experience to, even though, locked down in my apartment by myself, I've met people from all over the world that I wouldn't otherwise have connected to. So this will be a year of kind of building up all those relationships.
Cool. A lot to look forward to. Gabi, why don't you let our lovely audience know where they can find you and your work, whatever you're working on the internet?
The best place to find me is actually on Twitter, @Fleury, FLEURY, GS as in Sam. So that's kind of where I'm usually most active. And I also have a website, which I will link, that I update regularly. So if you want to kind of look at my papers or look at my YouTube channel or anything like that, it's all kind of consolidated in one place. And a good way to keep up with also what I'm doing as I go back into the field, hopefully in the next year or so. So, yeah.
Cool. It's been a really fun chat. Thanks for joining, Gabi.
Yeah, no, wonderful to meet you. And thanks for having me.
Cool. Cheers. And that, my dear listeners, was Gabi Fleury. We chatted a lot about the past, the present, and the future of conservation, as well as the research and technology involved there. So if you want to know a little bit more about that and what Gabi Fleury does, you can follow the links that I've posted in the description of this video, aka audio podcast. And if you liked everything that you see today, please leave a like on YouTube, rate and review on podcast services, and follow the overall show in the future. Thank you so much for listening. Otherwise, stay tuned and cheers.